Okay, welcome everyone to Political Ideas. Today I'm going to finish up the lecture on Marx, and I'm going to carry on with Nietzsche. And by the end of this lecture, we'll be on track for the last lecture, which covers a lot of ground. But I want to speak briefly about Marx and Nietzsche as a pair before I then go further into developing or elaborating upon the core theory of Marx and the core ideas that Marx deploys, and then going on to Nietzsche. In some ways, I think both Marx and Nietzsche are the reaction to the crisis of religious faith amongst the intelligentsia, or the overthrow of religious faith amongst the intelligentsia. Now, both Marx and Nietzsche are German, and what's very interesting is that generally in Germany, because they went through the Reformation, and because in France the Reformation was thwarted by the massacre and then expulsions of the Huguenots, and that really meant, and this also had to do with, you might recall this also had to do with the Gallic Church in France, but also the rise, especially in Paris, though in the urban centres more generally, but really very much so in Paris, a hostility to the church that was widespread. And to put that in a nutshell, that hostility largely came from the church in France allying itself so closely with the old regime, at least the upper clergy, and in the struggle against the old regime by the professional classes for political power, the church was seen through a very hated kind of window. Now, in Germany, in the main, because of the Reformation, although of course the Reformation only took place in the northern states, but generally also, though somewhat unlike France, there had been the Counter-Reformation within the Catholic Church, and that in a sense made certain changes, not completely so, but made certain changes which ultimately were quite popular within the body of the faithful. But as Germany did not go through that Reformation, the intelligentsia, if anything, radicalized their critique of religion much more so than in France. And you may recall in the French Revolution, I'm sure I raised this, that one issue that would ultimately divide the Jacobins amongst themselves, and there were a few issues that divided I should say the Montagnards, but who ran the Committee of Public Safety. It was the matter of de-Christianization. Now, essentially, the civic clergy, you might recall again that the clergy all had to take an oath of loyalty to the state, and this was obviously done to diminish the power of Rome. But ultimately, what was happening is that intelligentsia were pushing into the Catholic Church in France the doctrine of deism. And the point about the doctrine of deism, as you recall from the lecture on Descartes, it basically identifies God as a supreme lawgiver and a moral lawgiver, but that's pretty well it. The rest of the historical vicissitudes and experiences and traditions of the Christian faith ultimately vanish in deism. But there was also a more radical wing, and that was in part led by Jacques Hébert, who was, if you were to use the terms left and right in terms of the French Revolution, he was on the left flank of Robespierre, and Robespierre is frequently positioned on the left. But Hébert wanted a pushing through, and not just him, a number of the intelligentsia or revolutionaries in France wanted to push through, so not even deism would be left. And as I said, that became a source of dispute between, and Robespierre's faction won on that, but then Robespierre was quickly done over. And eventually, with the Restoration and the Directory, and then Napoleon's victory, ultimately the revolution experienced a great setback. And there were certain things that the revolution was never able to, certain voids, if you like, that the revolution was not really able to fulfill in its overthrowing of the church. And two of those especially were the role the church played in, or three of them were, in orphanages, hospitals, and schools. And that took a long time before the French state was able to have a greater overlording of those institutions, or lording over those institutions. But I said in Germany, life went on pretty well, as is for most people, but in the intelligentsia strata, as I said, the critique of religion took on a far greater intellectual ferocity than it did in what was happening at the same time in France. Although, as I say that, there are a number of socialists in France also who had influenced Marx, and some intelligentsia that were very anti-religious. Okay, and so in both Marx and Nietzsche, the critique of religion is going to play a very important part. Ultimately, and you will recall me mentioning this last week, Marx sees religion as a kind of projection. He gets this from Feuerbach, a kind of projection into the beyond of the needs of human beings, and because they're not met here on earth, they, in a sense, well, they defer it to the beyond. So for Marx, religious critique is the kind of gaining of political wisdom. And what we'll see in Nietzsche is a far more sophisticated examination of the way in which Christianity has permeated culturally. And so it's a far deeper analysis. But as soon as I say that, I would also have to say that in terms of a detailed knowledge of the history of the church, I don't think either Marx or Nietzsche would pass in his theology exam or a history of the church exam. I don't think either would pass. I think they didn't know that much. And this is a general thing I want to say. Given that Marx and Nietzsche have become so important in 20th and 21st century thought amongst the intelligentsia, they become so lionized. I'm always astounded how people are so willing to make idols of other people whose claim to fame or whose expertise or whose knowledge is, I think, really far more limited. But so they become heroes, and for many people, what they know, that is what Marx or Nietzsche knew, and we'll see very late in the lecture how in France they tend to get blurred, which as you listen through this lecture, you'll see that takes quite a bit of ingenuity, because in some ways they line up very antithetically politically. But nevertheless, they tend to get merged, especially in France, which then, as I'll point out next week, the French intelligentsia of the 1960s and 1970s has a huge impact upon the academic kind of narratives that develop, especially in certain streams of social and political philosophy, and in literary studies, and in the humanities more widely. They have a huge impact. So Marx and Nietzsche then tend to, as I said, get joined. Now, but one thing they do have, and they get lionized, and I said, I think they're treated as idols. And so one of the reasons, in a sense, I push the criticism of this much more, and you will have noticed I'm far more critical of Marx and Nietzsche than generally I am of others. And in a way, that's because no one, or very few people, are going back and really deploying earlier social philosophers. Some might do it with Locke, some might but almost no one else that we've mentioned. There's no one prior to Marx and Nietzsche. If I was giving a lecture on Kant, I'd give him a hammering too, because in a different, very different kind of way, I think he has a strong presence. But because of that, because they're so valorized, I think it's really beholden on me to provide the critique so you're not blinded by ultimately what I think is a very uncritical appropriation and deployment of these two thinkers, very uncritical. And given where we're at now and how they have shaped so many of the go-to ideas, ways of thinking about the social and political world, I think it's really important that I at least give you the opportunity for you to see that these two guys make a lot of mistakes. It's not that, and were they not so passionate? Were they not so sure that they knew the solution to the human circumstances, and that they, in a sense, provided, I'll use a religious term, an eschatological viewpoint, and they were the two greatest eschatologists of the 19th century. And the word eschatology comes from religion, and it means the judgment of final things. And this is exactly what Marx and Nietzsche are setting themselves up to do. Ultimately, they're setting themselves up not only of deciding what the future should be, but what should die from the human past, what should live, and who should die and who should live. So there's a tremendous amount of violence within this kind of eschatological visions of these two 19th century thinkers, which you may never get any sense of that from reading so many of the books that are written on them, because they're so anodyne in their representation, as if just accepting these ideas, for example, that you can overthrow the bourgeoisie, you can eliminate capitalism, is an easy peasy kind of thing that won't break out into all sorts of explosions. In the case of Nietzsche, I'd have to say that in the main, I find so much literature that is written on Nietzsche to be extremely poor, because they do not think through the problem with him, and they tend to treat Nietzsche as far more cuddly, in a sense. It's far more like a nice person in the 20th century than Nietzsche's program really is. And that will come out also in the lecture. So I think Marx and Nietzsche are a very good pairing in this respect. And as I said, they're the two most influential thinkers by far in terms of social and political thinking from the 19th century. And at the same time, as we hit the 21st century, I think it is a disaster to take your intellectual equipment from solutions to problems that were perceived in the 19th century. Now, some of these problems persist. And now let me say, with respect to Marx, for example, although I've been very critical, it is important to point out that the process of industrialization or the rapid pace of industrialization in the Industrial Revolution, particularly in the 19th century, created very harsh and grim conditions for the working class. But, as I also mentioned last week, things were changing very drastically. And within a couple of generations, circumstances in the main for the working class had improved considerably. And you have to consider, not only in relation, which Marx tends to do, in relationship to what he calls the bourgeoisie, which in his mind is purely the owners of capital. And so he, as I said last week, he severs basically the investing class from the professional classes, of which he himself is really a member, at least in his training, of the professional classes, the lawyers, doctors, etc., etc. And he severs that, and ultimately that enables people, academics, for example, to think of themselves as kind of like the working class. And I think this is really fantastical. But I'll come back to class theory in general. So one thing I'd say, yes, Marx was onto the fact that there was this real hardship, alienation. By the way, the philosopher Hegel, I don't think Marx knew this because it was in an unpublished work, and I've seen no reference to this. But the philosopher Hegel, who I mentioned last week, had also talked in a work published posthumously called the Jena Writings from Jena in Germany. He had talked about alienation that was accompanying industrialization. And it's a very good study, and it gives you a great insight into the times. And in some ways, Marx that's what he's talking about, these pretty grim conditions. But then the question is what he does with it, and he starts to make all these predictions. And then the question is his diagnosis really accurate? And this is where we hit the problems. When we look at Nietzsche, we'll see it's a very different problem. That ultimately, as we'll see, Nietzsche's problem is the problem of culture. And Nietzsche sees a kind of, to use his term, a breeding of a kind of dumbed down, non-cultured breed of people, which for Nietzsche we'll see that he ultimately wants to save the few, not the many. He's not interested in the many. Whereas Marx, in a sense, wants to save the many. Both of them are saviors of something in that position. Both of them, if treated less as people that solve problems, that is, less as people to be followed, but if treated more like we would treat other scholars, would say both of them made certain contributions which in some ways were superseded, but of their time make a contribution. And you must remember that the development of ideas, insofar as ideas can be said to develop, and that's much harder in social thought than in the natural sciences, much harder in the social sciences. And there's all sorts of complex reasons for that I'm just going to bypass here, that were raised by various other important thinkers in the 19th century, like Willem Dilthey, for example. But there's if we could just see, for example, that the concept of class is a really important concept. Now, Marx didn't make this up, and in some ways he distorts, unfortunately, the concept. But nevertheless, that there is capital and labour. We'll see that there's differences. That in some ways, on many occasions, they're in antithesis to each other. That is definitely a sociological contribution. That we may go back into history and look for class disputes. That's very much something that Marx contributes to, and that's a very valuable contribution. The problem is he wants to do too much with it. He makes too much of it. But certainly, one can use the concept of us and look at especially certain moments of history and find valuable insights to be had from that. One of the other things I think is a really interesting insight of Marx is, I think, one of his best insights. But interestingly enough, it's an insight that most Marxists tended to drop. But that was the insight that the technology and the economic base of the society, that is the class relationship of the society, and the technology formed a coherence which would impact upon the other ideas and practices within a culture. And I think that is a really important insight. Unfortunately, he uses this language of mirroring, so one simply mirrors the other, as if you could read off. And the problem with that is that it requires too perfect a fit, and it fails to understand that the rhythm of ideas and the technological and economic processes and the rhythm of ideas is very much bound up with speech itself, because when we speak, we draw upon collective memory and we use our currency as names. And what they mean within a certain time, a certain epoch, will be quite different to what they meant 100 years or so or previously. But in a sense, names incubate, they have a slower, what's the word, incubation period, or they may incubate longer and then unleash, you know, as something triggers a certain response to a historical memory that may have laid dormant and now becomes reactivated. So it gets, in a sense, what Marx called the ideological plane can get very, very complex. And his way of trying to cut through that complexity by solely relating it to the economic base, I think that's deeply unsatisfactory. It's not compelling at all. Okay, so having raised that, and I'll go back into Nietzsche in more detail, as I said, let's get back to the picture that Marx has as a history of class struggle. So the history of the world has been the history of class struggle. He basically reads history in terms of primitive communism, slave-owning societies, feudal societies, capitalist society, and one, of course, that has never been tried, but which he sees as embryonically being generated out of the contradictions, as he calls them, between capital and labour or bourgeois society, that generated out, and provides a solution to what he calls the riddle of history. So in this sense, class is all about social place, opportunities, power. In the past, the ruling classes have been kings, nobles, capitalists. We might go forward to our time and say also that might include managers. Though I would elaborate and say, well, actually now it concerns a whole lot of ideas breakers that enter into the political realm, and who may not have a lot of wealth, but have a lot of prestige and a lot of status and able to have their, but then I'm starting to go beyond where Marx goes. For Marx, the poorer classes were the peasants, the slaves, the workers, and as I said, his vision, it's very what we call teleological. That is, there's a kind of purpose. There's a purpose within history, and that purpose, again, he came up with this in his mid-20s. That purpose comes from what human beings are, their species essence, their species nature, and that will be the full realization of that. Some Marxists argued that Marx was not teleological. What they have to do then is say those early writings don't really count in Marx's corpus. A very famous French Marxist called Louis Althusser made this argument, and he had a bit of a following in the 1960s and 1970s, but in the main, I don't think he won the argument at all, because the line of continuity in Marx's thinking between what he wants and his analysis of the circumstances that enable him to believe he gets what he wants, it's so strong, that line of continuity. And so many questions are asked in the latter books, and that's because he's answered them already earlier. So he's assuming that you know that, even if you haven't read it, in his own mind, he's settled that, so he's carrying on. Now, the other thing that's very important is that he tends to see classes, especially, and you recall me saying in his historical writings, he provided a much more complicated and indeed a much more accurate and really good historical analysis, except for the one problem that he kept reading the conflicts that were happening in the 1840s and the coup of Louis Napoleon. He kept reading them through his own end, his own objective. If that's not teleological, I don't know what is. So very teleological. And he sees classes always as conflict, and it's a zero-sum game. So capitalism, for example, gets what it has because workers don't get something. Historically, again, there's instances which confirm this, but there's multiple instances where you look at the trade-off between being working the land and being a soldier, for example, where you can see there's really a trade-off. It's not so straightforward. It is true that soldiers can extract resources from the peasantry through force, but where communities have settled down, there tends to be some kind of symbiotic relationship. And one of the things we find, of course, is that very often it's members of the peasantry go into the army. This was the case in Russia up until the Russian Revolution. This was happening even at the time of the Russian Revolution. So this is, again, concept of class as deployed by Marx is deeply unsatisfying. It can be seen sometimes, but it's often oversimplified. And then he argued that only a classless society will enable the eliminating the pool of unemployed, the poverty, alienation, and class warfare. And this will begin a new period of history. And again, the problem is, if you take the division of labour as a condition of wealth, which any economist does, and it's simply because it is, because without the division of labour, how do you have things like steel and all the things you can make with that, or, you know, anything that requires complicated association in order to transform a resource, and even to gather resources like mining. This is the idea that the division of labour can just be done away with. Ultimately, I mentioned last week that Marx himself gives up on that idea. Even though he speaks of it in those early manuscripts, later he says, well, the real thing about socialism will be the shortening of the working day. Okay, but that's a million miles away. If you're a miner, you're still a miner. If you're an engineer or God knows what, you know, whatever skill you have. And generally, political economy is not restricted by its understanding of class in the way that Marx is, because it sees wherever you have the division of labour, then you have other classes. Some of them will have more sociological things in common. And you see that, you know, the way I say that. So you can see that kind of confirms Marx's point about the economy provided the basis of the social. So there is a lot of truth in that. That the issue, though, is how good, how sophisticated, how broad your understanding of political economy is, and how then your sociological explanations are informed by that, but not imprisoned by that. So anyway, in Marx, it all comes down to, remember me saying in Capital, he comes up with this idea of, he uses the labour theory of value, and he basically says, or he says, that in the transformation of one set of commodities into something else, so the capitalist purchases, say, wool, and the workers make jumpers, what the capitalist takes as a profit is really the amount of work that the worker has put in, as calculated, and this is very loosely and completely unconvincingly done in Marx, that is the labour power in time, or labour power, timed labour power, that has added the value in the transformation of wool into jumpers. And then instead of the workers getting the full compensation for that, the capitalist has accrued that profit to themselves. What Marx leaves out of the picture is the entrepreneur who recognizes a market opportunity and therefore finds a way to garner capital to get resources together so there is profitability and employment. So where is that going to come from? How is that going to occur? We know that what capitalism is doing, what a market economy is doing, is giving a monetary advantage to anyone that is successfully able to do that. And there's no guarantee that someone who wants to set up a business is going to be successful. There has to be consumers that want what you produce. Now, all of this gets put on hold by Marx. That's like the epiphenomenon or the surface. But for economists generally, that's not the epiphenomenon or the surface, that's the process. You can't skip that. Okay. Now, what this also means, given what I've just said, this is called the labour theory of value, is that it is only living labour that creates value. It's only living labour. So that's why you don't need a capitalist. That's why you don't need entrepreneurship. That's why you don't even need a market. So all these things that we can associate with development, which, by the way, Marx himself associates with development in the Communist Manifesto and elsewhere, where he talks about the great triumphs of bourgeois society, what it's been able to create. And then he turns to the destructive components of it, which is not wrong. It is a very destructive process. Any society wanting to modernize has to completely tear up, uproot, destroy older social relationships, older forms of economic life, and that is a terrifying and terrible thing. And again, I mentioned that last week when I spoke about Thomas More. I spoke about what happened in England and how Marx makes much of that in his work, Capital. So this is what I was talking about before is surplus value. So it's surplus value is what capitalists extract from living labour power. Now, Marx then makes a distinction, and again, he's onto something quite good on one side of this, quite insightful. So he says, look, there's two ways in which the surplus can be extracted from the workers, or can be generated by the workers. One is they simply work a very long time. And so basically what he's saying is, say you've got a 12-hour day. The wage that the worker gets is the amount of time that they've spent reproducing themselves, being able to get their own sustenance, and what they need to live in that society. And again, he just treats this as something that, you know, is more or less calculable and that you would know, and that's really going into the process. And again, he leaves out market demand for that. He just assumes market demand. So if you work 12 hours a day, you get paid, say, for 2 hours, the other 10 hours that's been appropriated. That's one way. So to get more profitability, you might force the workers to work 13 or 14 hours a day or 15 hours a day. Now, there's certainly some economies, and they're usually agrarian, bordering on slave economies that do this, where they have very cheap labour. And let's just say they're not, well, we're not talking, say, the slave plantations, which are a different mode of production, but where you've got free labourers come in, but they work very, very long hours. And usually that's going to be in something like an agrarian economy, but it might have been in industry. But one of the things that occurred very quickly, and Marx was very aware of this, was that the quality of the work would diminish the longer that you work. So if you're tired and you're hungry, you're not well nourished, and you're just not performing very well. And this would become the basis of in the early part of the 20th century, a guy called Frederick Taylor started introducing time and management studies, and that was raising the question for industry of what's the most productive way to get work out of your employees, and that includes how much time can they spend in the job. So what's the most efficient amount of time to have someone doing something? Okay, so he calls that absolute surplus value. Now, then he introduced, and that's the kind of fair enough thing. You know, you can work someone to death, but it's not that interesting. What's more interesting in Marx is this bit. And it's a good example of he's onto something, but then he gets it wrong. And this is what he calls relative surplus value. So the good thing is that Marx recognizes that the more circulation you can have of a commodity, the greater the circulatory capacity of the commodity. So, and the rate of production. So let's take absolute surplus relative value and relative surplus value. If I spend 10 hours, say there's 10 of us in a factory, and we spend 12 hours each producing something, and but we only get paid for 2 hours, that surplus value is like 8 hours worth. But then he says, if we multiply the number in the factory, but the equipment that we use is also making the circulation of it more, then the cost of the commodity will come down. So it'll be cheaper, but we're extracting more because there's more being produced by the workers. So it's not just time in itself that matters, it's time in terms of the productive capacity and the circulatory rate of production there. Now, again, the problem with this is that Marx is simply assuming what he's denying. And that is, he recognizes that labour saving, and he calls it labour displacement, because I said you have 100 come in and they can do more. But let's say what the 100 are doing is no longer simply 10 by 10, but it's really 10 by 100. So instead of now employing 1,000 people, you're only employing 100. So this, for Marx, is where the saving has been made. But so on the one hand, is recognizing that there's an incentive in capitalism to use technologies which will displace labor. That's true, and he's given a kind of the stuff about circulation. That's a decent insight into what is driving the show, because circulation of production, or intensification of production, I should have used the word intensification rather than circulation, but intensification generates greater production, which generates greater spread of circulation of commodities. So this for Marx is what he calls relative surplus value, but it's only because you've got the machinery. But because Marx is committed to the idea that only living labour power matters in the production of surplus value, he therefore sees that this labour displacing technology is ultimately leading to a condition where there will no longer be any surplus value. So in a sense, in the middle of the 19th century, he's seeing a kind of view of the world as completely run by technology, where all these starving people don't have anything because they can't get work. On the other hand, and this is a problem. Now, Marx did recognise, and he could see this, but again, he didn't do enough with it. He did recognise that the more a society became technologised, the greater the need there would be for human services. And human services, all sorts of human services, start to be generated out of the technological economic process, which hitherto didn't exist. You can think of millions of them. You know, where was chiropractic, 150 years ago? You think of all of people painting other people's nails. Hairdressers, they were hairdressers, okay, but you get what I mean. There's all these other service industries that get spread up. The tourist industries, to pull one out of my head. Okay, so Marx recognizes that, but he's still stuck with this picture that it's the capitalists in their competition with each other for profits. And he's right, capitalists do, everyone in the market is caught up in a search for profits, and it's a little bit like empires. Profitability drives you forward, and if you sit on your laurels around that, you very well, unless you can corner a niche market, but even when you corner a niche market, someone else will find a way to do cheaper. So you make Gibson guitars, and then someone comes along and says, well, let's not make them in the US anymore. Let's make them in Korea. We call them an Epiphone. And it's much cheaper. The quality is not that much different. People might disagree on that. Some might say Epiphones are even better, whatever. But you can see that that's the kind of drive that's inherent in the capitalist dynamic. So what Marx is saying is, but this increase in technology, he's not really thinking about the infinite plasticity of human needs that just keeps coming up with new and new things that people may think they want, or may want. And then, of course, want and need, many Marxists go into that difference. So we have a society that's saturated with things that we don't need. But the question of need and want is, look, you don't need an iPad, but once you have access to it, you think, wow, I want that. You don't need an electric guitar, but once you have access to it, I want that. So again, it's a very static model that Marx is tending to use in terms of human need. And it goes back to the 1844 manuscripts, where he thinks he's discovered a human essence. And when he talks about its fulfillment, he thinks he's saying something meaningful. Whereas I think, apart from the fact, and he's onto something here, that if you're working, drudge labor, and you've got no energy left of it from it, and you're physically all eaten up, yes, that's true. There's nothing left. But if you're just doing something in your daily life and it doesn't leave you exhausted, and that gives you money that you can go on trips and you can travel and you can do this and that, then that's quite a different thing. But see, for Marx, what he believed was that capitalism was constantly creating a permanent, and he saw this as never growing pool of unemployment, and what he calls the theory of immiserization. And this was the problem he, and especially Engels, was trying to deal with late in his life, and I mentioned that, because Marx's theory was saying the working class get poorer and poorer. Now, this proved not to be true. It is true, and many Marxian style of arguments will point out how huge the profit becomes with capitalism. So the comparative rate, there's a whole book on this, a recent book, big book, by a guy called Thomas Piketty, called Capital, and he chooses, he's using the same title as Marx's work. And the book is all about how relative inequality that has accompanied the development of capitalism and most recently, where we see how unequal. And that's true. That's true. I wouldn't want to argue against that. But in a sense, it's so what? The reason there is so much inequality, and the state is one way of ameliorating this, and that's a whole other question. And it's a question that Marx initially thought the state would never do. Again, I touched on this last week, because he did not foresee the working class ever having access to the ballot. And this was beginning to change in his lifetime. There were developments in Germany where, although they didn't, they still weren't voting specifically. Bismarck had done deals with the Social Democrats insofar as he could see that this was an important component of the society. He didn't want it to have political power, but he thought that by giving them, and there wasn't all that wrong about this, by giving them pensions and certain basically welfare conditions, a kind of safety net, this would act as a way of ameliorating the problems of wealth inequality. And this has been true, it's been right, and ultimately that's the kind of argument that Piketty is going for. He's just wanting more of that. But the fact that you would have greater inequality when you've got groups of people who are able to take people's savings in banks or their pension funds and go and search out where there might be greater profitability, which of course it's anyone who's got money in superannuation, for example, or money in a bank, is going to benefit from that extra profitability. And so the circulatory system, the way it operates, and the role of finance capital in directing money towards investment potential, that comes at a huge rate of profit, but it also creates profitability for other people who are investing with them. I'm not making a moral argument. I'm not celebrating it, so to speak, but it is a way, it does explain the huge amount of wealth that's generated in industrial lands. It is also being offset with relative increase in inequality, but Marx wasn't talking about the relative inequality. He was talking about the absolute nature of poverty. And there's a world of difference between relative inequality. If I've got a house and a garden, like many members of the working class in Australia, certainly even more so a generation or two back, when housing ownership was higher, it's not really going to worry me so much that someone else has got, a house on the North Shore of Sydney and I can't afford that. The fact is that I can look after my family, I can pass this inheritance on. So, and no one has ever said that a liberal economy, the kind of economy of a market system, is equal. It's not, because the market is ipso facto an unequal, a way of measuring the inequality of value. It's the opposite of equalizing value. It's the opposite, because people show through their willingness to purchase something given their capacity, which will vary, of course. Equality doesn't come into it. It just doesn't come into it. The state then might think what we want to do is ameliorate where the inequality is potentially socially explosive, or we have a view of ourselves as a political culture, a social culture, and we would like to even things up. All of this has not only been done it's not only doable, it has been done. And it has been done because of the interpenetration of markets and capital. And markets and states. And I've said this a number of times now, markets cannot function without states. And if a state can function without capital, but ultimately you need wealth generation even if you have strong military capacity. This was ultimately what did the Soviet Union. It couldn't keep up with the military capacity because its mechanisms of production, having dispensed with the market, ultimately brought it to a standstill. I'll take this up briefly a bit later. So what Marx is saying is there's ever going to be this greater unemployment. There will be a crisis of profits. There will be what he calls a falling rate of profit. He deals with this in the third volume of Capital. Again, he's got a very static view of the kind of numbers of profitable firms. He sees this tendency towards monopolization. He's not wrong about the tendency of monopolization, but and monopolization really does come with a whole lot of social dangers. But you don't have to be a Marxist to recognize this, and you don't have to argue that the way to stop this is to simply have no private property. That's a little bit like, you want to kill a mouse in a house and you blow up the house. But it is going to be, it is the working out of the dynamics between state and market. That's very experimental. And the thing about Marx is he's writing when the expansion or the intensification of market possibilities was unrivaled in human history. And he's jumped on the bus very early, and he thinks he knows the exact outcome of it, and he can't, and he doesn't, and no one could know it. He can be prophetic, and in some way both Marx and Nietzsche are prophets. There's something of, as I said, fills in the void left by the dissipation, especially in the intelligentsia, amongst the by the decline of religious faith. That's why Raymond Aron once said, you remember Marx's religion is the opiate of the people. Raymond Aron, much more conservative, tended to be quite social democratic, so not anti-state market relationship. But Aron says Marxism is the opiate of the intellectuals. I think interesting play on words. Okay, so what Marx then sees is that socialist revolution is inevitable. It's going to be inevitable. And he claims that this is what makes his theory unique. These are very big claims. They're massive claims. Okay. So, as it develops, and I mentioned this, Gareth Stedman Jones, who had been a Marxist, writes about the fact that ultimately Marx comes a cropper when writing Capital. He never finishes volumes 2 and 3, and he says that's because he knew it wasn't going to work. Now, I'd never thought of that until I read Stedman Jones's work. I thought, wow, that's really interesting. And I think he's probably right. But you know, he left all these notebooks for Engels to publish posthumously, but the theory had already run aground. And some Russian Marxists, because Marx gets translated in about 1871 into Russia, and they say, look, we've got a history of peasant communes here. Do you think we can bypass capitalism? And Marx says yes. And it just makes no sense. Everything is written in Capital. You can throw it out the window if that's the case. So increasing polarization. He says the thing about capitalism is it socializes labor. So basically you can just pick off the capitalists and they would go. And in the kind of story that he's presenting, you're just basically, you know, getting rid of a relative handful of people. And again, the simplification of the caste system, you know, fantastic. So I've already given a number of these criticisms. Let's run through them very quickly. It's impossible to eliminate the division of labour and have large-scale production. Classes all perform different functions. The idea that people will spontaneously organise themselves into cooperative units for the benefit of the entire society is ultimately assuming classlessness. It assumes what you've got to demonstrate, that you will have a classless society. If they did that, then there wouldn't be class division. But then again, you wouldn't need a division of labour. Then again, you would know what it is that people wanted to consume without having tested it through a price signalling system. Classes are internally contradictory. That's very important. And we saw Marx showing this with Capital in the writing on the 18th Brumaire and the writings on the revolutions of 1848. He shows the disparity or the contestation between industrial and finance capital, but he doesn't develop this. And in fact, had he developed that, he couldn't have come up with the theory he does. And it's the same true with the working classes. If you've got one set of skills and people are ready to pay you for that, you're not going to have anything in common necessarily with another bunch of people who don't have that skills. In fact, what you'll try and do, and again, historically, as we know from study of the guilds, which precede the modern, is that people hang on to their skill sets very tightly and don't want other people to get into the game. And in some ways, you could say trade unions serve that purpose. Trade unionism is a kind of like a modern guild system in its way. There's certain differences, but it's basically a protection racket for those people with those skills in those industries in order to keep their wages high. Marx's theory of economic production, which is based, economic crisis, is based upon this idea of overproduction. So all this stuff is being produced, but it's not being produced through living labour, and it's just sitting there, and so all you need to do is go and take it and then man the factories and so on. The problem with that, it's really not true. Most of the crises we can see in the 20th century, and sometimes Marx is said to be, his political economy is valuable because it factors in economic crises, and economic crises happen very regularly within capitalism. Capitalism is not a smooth system. It's up and down. It is a system in which there are sometimes big losers No doubt about that. The question is, if you can replace that with something, and here's the point, is it didn't arise through design, it arose through trial and error. And no one was going to design a system by sitting on their ass as if it's like a mathematical or geometrical problem. Again, that's part of the problem with Marx. So, as we see in the development of the crises of capitalism, or the history of the crisis of capitalism, that the expansion of credit is by far the biggest source of capital crisis, not overproduction. That's it. So he's got the wrong theory. The liberal theory of subjective value, which is basically a theory of markets, and it's what you learn when you study Economics 101. Marx missed that. That was all taking place. That was all happening and he's basically lumbered with the kind of economics that you could find anticipations of in Locke, in Adam Smith, and in David Ricardo, all of them who get some things very right, but ultimately subjective value doesn't play a big enough role in it. And there's no place for the theory for the entrepreneur. Now, given that the theory there's something fundamentally wrong with it, it's not surprising that its fates would all mean something about it is jettisoned. The first fate that we'll speak of is social democracy. And that's what happened in the West. So remember, his idea was most industrialized countries would have the crisis first. But his picture was such, he recognized that liberal capitalism was ultimately a globalist system. But given the shape of the world in the time he was writing, it's extraordinary that, there was so much underdevelopment, and Marx had already predicted what the end would be. Again, it's fantastical. So, but in the industrialized countries, workers had started to get the vote. Not everywhere, but certainly in the United Kingdom and then in France. And when they get the vote, one of the things that's happening, and then in Germany, or at least it's in Germany at this stage, it's more an advisory legislative body rather than a parliamentary, strictly speaking, a parliamentary body. But the move is now towards parliamentary socialism. And the great theorist of this was a very close associate of Friedrich Engels. So he's a very prominent figure in the Marxist movement in the 19th century. And then he comes to do the figures on the fate of the development of the working class, housing ownership, all these, wages, and he realizes Marx's theory, it just doesn't work. He's in favor of certain industries being nationalized, but that's a completely different thing to this, this vision of communism, this cooperative, spontaneous system. And so this is basically parliamentary socialism. It's a welfare state. The state could nationalize certain key sectors of industry and ensure national interest. Now, in Germany, we see that this kind of social democracy comes out of the workers' movement, and Marx had a big impact upon that. In Great Britain, you end up with the same sets of ideas, but where Marxism hasn't been particularly strong at all. So it's really in the institutional and historical circumstances and development that are certainly bound up with capital and labour, no doubt about that. But it takes on a dynamic. And I mentioned Marx was already using reports by the government about the terrible working conditions of the workers in England. So it was very clear that in the United Kingdom, there's an attempt to try and deal with the fact that there were all sorts of terrible things happening among the working class and the social damage that this would do. Social democracy, labour movements, welfare state, that's one fate, and it's ultimately a fate in which Marxism is just made redundant. It's just made redundant. But the other two fates is very important components of Marx that are made redundant. The second fate is Leninism or Bolshevism. And everywhere that you had living communism or living socialism, as opposed to social democracy. Okay, Lenin had called himself a social democrat, but when I mean social democracy, I mean parliamentary style democracy with certain socialist features, primarily nationalisation, use of the bureaucracy to achieve certain welfare objectives and public good objectives. Lenin had introduced a dimension into his theory which was deeply opposed by Marx, and it came from Louis Blanqui, but it didn't just come from Blanqui. It was, you could say it developed separately in France under Blanqui, but it also came out of the Russian experience of terrorist cells being developed as part of the radicalization of the intelligentsia in the second part of the 19th century. And Lenin had basically argued, or had argued, that the party had to be a vanguard consciousness. Otherwise, the best that the workers would develop would be a kind of trade union consciousness, and that would thwart the whole socialist objective. He had also argued that imperialism was the natural way in which capitalism would develop, and so that basically meant the working class were doing well in the developed world because the third world, as it would later be called, the colonized world, would be so poor. So again, it's that zero-sum game. Plausible insofar as there certainly were colonialist nations were interested in extracting resources. The problem with the theory was the actual percentage of GDP that was being supplied with the colonies was around 3 or 4%. It was relatively negligible. And what it's forgetting is that the cost of running a colony ultimately makes it unviable economically. And that's why the United States is such a successful superpower, because economically it's a hegemon, it's leading, it uses its military and surveillance techniques, etc., to do its bidding, but it uses economic leverage to get what it wants, and that ties into its military leverage, but ultimately it doesn't need to colonize. So in the early part of the 20th century, the United States set itself, like actually before then, but in the early part of the 20th century, when the Russian Revolution was happening, America was still primarily following a colonialist model, and very quickly it had dropped that. Even pretty well by the end of the First War, it starts to move in a different direction. So Lenin would also ultimately, and what would happen in both Russia and China and a number of other countries, the peasantry would play a huge part in the success of the revolution, because they were by far, in these underdeveloped countries, the biggest percentage of the population, and wherever they were successful, it was the peasantry that would be most killed in largest numbers. And it all came back to one of the components of Marx's communist 10-point program about industrial armies of labor for agriculture. And this was fought bitterly against by the peasantry, and forced collectivization would lead to mass deaths. Ultimately, though, World War I had demonstrated national interests, had taken priority, and when Stalin comes along, he introduces socialism in one country, and he recognizes basically, and this occurs later, but when he comes to the Second World War, his Red Army are fighting, one, out of fear of anything that may happen to their family if they go back and they haven't moved forward, but two, they're fighting for the motherland. And all of Stalin's speeches, not in this subject, but in my War, Revolutions and Terror, I argue that the huge distinction that some academics want to make between, or the major distinction they want to make between Lenin and Stalin, simply doesn't wash. It's historical rubbish. Even though Lenin didn't particularly like Stalin. Stalin had insulted his wife in whatever. Okay. And the other reversal is, of course, that in undeveloped countries you've got to build socialism. So this is kind of technocratic, armed camp, and in fact, the Soviet Union was one of the, along with the National Socialists, was one of the two major ideological centers in which a slaved component of the economy was intrinsic to its production, and in fact more so in the Soviet system than in the Nazi system. So this is something, again, completely unforeseen. And here's a more general point I want to raise, is that in the main, people never get what they want. I've said this to you before. The French revolutionaries didn't get it, the Marxists didn't get it, because we can't read enough of reality to see what it is really you want. So if you want profits, get them to stick to pretty simple things rather than society. Okay. So the Marxist theory versus Russia, China is facts. And there's no end of academics who say, oh, Marxism, and you hear it at dinner parties, oh, Marxism is a good theory, but it doesn't work out in practice. It's not a good theory. A good theory would identify practicalities that would be tested. Marx never tests his theory, in spite of him calling for endless critique or quote you something over the page. But in theory, communism for the industrial working class, it would be radical democratic. This didn't happen. Russia not industrialized, same as China, very few proletarians. In Russia, more so even than China, they happen to be in the urban centers, especially Petrograd and Moscow. They were important in terms of the immediate victory of the Bolsheviks, but ultimately that all turned into a civil war, and there were other reasons why the Bolsheviks were victorious. And the Communist Party became a dictatorship. So when the other thing is, Marxism is a really great theory, but forget what happened in Russia and China. That's not real Marxism. Give me a break. This is just terrible thinking. It's terrible thinking, and I find intellectuals saying it, and I'm just gobsmacked at their stupidity. Really, I'm expressing myself, I know, in a rather passionate manner, but you'd think people who spend their lives writing books and reading would think a bit. But you can't say that they weren't pure enough. When you see the problems that they face, people like Lenin or Mao Zedong, they were the problems of practicality, and Marx didn't come within cooey of being able to read those practicalities. So how could, yes, okay, it wasn't really tried, and it couldn't have been tried, and it wouldn't have been better, but as much of it as it could be applied was tried, and it was a disaster, and it ended up a dictatorship for a very simple reason. Strangely enough, people don't like being dispossessed of their property if they have property. People didn't like the fact that that they were forced to work in areas where if they didn't work there, they could be shot or sent off to a prison camp. Funnily enough, people didn't like that. Funnily enough, an economy simply cannot function by endless sets of town hall meetings where someone has to go and provide all the data about what the economic resources are and how they're to be done, and that will be done efficiently. This is just nuts. Not even worth taking seriously. To me, it's like saying 1 and 1 is, 0.05 with the square root of a circle with a plus sign and a funny face at the end of it. The third vision is academic and cultural Marxism. This is Leninism. The fate of Leninism is to create a political structure which they maintain in China and a few other countries in the world. But it's interesting that the Leninist party and the fascist way of doing business is not really that different. Both of them, I mentioned both of them ultimately revolve around leadership and the cult of the personality, a million miles away from any kind of radical democracy. This, you remember me saying about Rousseau, it was seen by Rousseau's critics, his contemporary critics, or relatively contemporary critics, that Rousseauianism would always end up dictatorial. And we saw that in the French Revolution with the Committee of Public Safety, how the only way they could save the revolution was being a dictatorship. It's exactly the same in the fate of Leninism. But the area in which Marxism has been most successful is the area that has nothing whatever to do with the working class that it's developed, and hence also nothing to do with his predictions about capital. So in a way, it's the area in which there's a certain inoculation taking place against reality, and it's because it is purely in the realm of ideas. It's purely in the realm of ideas. So in the realm of where ideas are investigated, manufactured, surveyed, disseminated, etc., Marxism has a real life, and there's endless people writing articles in academic journals about how great Marxism is because they just ignore those other things, and what they then focus upon is the ideational nature, not subjected to any really critical economic robust analysis, usually because it's not. There are very few Marxist economists. There were some. There were a number in the 20th century, but nowadays, really, the only Marxist economists that are left are like those Japanese soldiers that found 20 years up later after hiding in a cave at the end of the Second World War. They're really like that. They're really outliers, and they don't have any credibility in the profession at all. But they're hanging on grimly to a theory of economics that just doesn't work. Whereas, by and large, what happens with academic and cultural Marxism is it assumes the adequacy of the critique of capitalism, so it repeats that, and what it's got going for it is capitalism is not fair. Yes. Capitalism is unequal. Yes, all true. All true. The problem is that they haven't a clue of what would be a superior economy. Now, if I talk about the cultural and academic Marxists, I'll mention in passing Antonio Gramsci, who sadly was imprisoned and tortured under Mussolini by the Italian fascists. Now, he still very much believed in Marxist economics had the solution. So he hasn't really dropped the working class as others later will do. But he did argue that the job of Marxism, of Marxists, of the party members especially, and the intelligentsia was to basically capture the cultural institutions, and so that an economic revolution would follow. So that was his thinking. And in the 1960s, the New Left, especially in Great Britain, but not only Great Britain, were busily reproducing, translating the writings of Gramsci, and he was really being hailed. And look, you can see why this would be attractive. If you believe the theory, because that's what you've learned, you've read a few books, maybe a few dozen books, maybe 100 books, maybe a couple of hundred books, and that's what you think is the case. Well, and you're teaching in a school or a university, or you're working as a journalist, where all that is being tested is your ideas against other ideas. Journalism once, there was more strictures on it than I think than now, but that's another point. Here you've got free reign. Any mistakes you make are just air. They don't really matter. And they're not going to be picked up, because if you can form a group around you that think the same things, read the same things, publish the same thing, and the institution, its currency is the prestige and promotions that come from your so-called research, and you form a consensus where other people review your work, this then becomes a narrative that has a consensual appeal. Not only consensual appeal, if enough of you get employed in a certain area, then you'll constantly deploy people just like you. So this leaves the institutions which are necessary for the reproduction or the training of the skilled elites in the university. They're particularly susceptible to any kind of ideational theory. And given that this is a theory that is based upon the overcoming of emancipation, This gives it a really, compelling kind of moral credibility. The question is whether it can achieve that, and that's not going to be asked that's not going to be asked by the people who are studying culture, because what would they know? How would they know it? How would they test it? And they don't. Amongst the others, I'll just briefly mention the Frankfurt School, the New Left, literary criticism, and then the French post-structuralists I'll talk about a little bit next week, feminism, basically all committed to the ruthless critique of all existing things, Marx. Now just think of that a minute. That means you know something that those people in existence, those classes, don't know. So what is it that you know? And the answer very simply is you know a better way because you've got a better set of ideas to make that way. But here's the rub. Because those ideas have not been instantiated, they haven't been actualized, because they're purely ideas. And Marx hated idealism, and yet he's such an idealist. His whole critique of Hegel in his early writing is that Hegel is too idealistic. And what he means by idealistic, he means too much governed by ideas rather than understanding of socio-economic processes. The problem is that Marx has a very limited grasp of the socio-economic processes, in part simply because they haven't happened yet, and in part because anyone has a limited understanding of those processes. Me, you, everybody knows very little, very small, very big problem. And I love this bit from Marx. We demand from criticism above all that it should have a critical attitude to itself and not overlook the difficulty of its subject matter. Well, very good. I only wish Marx had done more of that, because there's not one critical model in his work of the labour theory of value, or an attempt to model possibility of resource extraction, signalling, etc., that would come out of communists, or that would happen where you don't have markets. What Marx then is part of, it's not only academic and cultural Marxism, it's the various other schools of radical critique. I said post-structuralism, feminism, and then you start taking identity politics. All of these ways of seeing the world tend to inflect the processes of the world through the experience of a group that is seen as oppressed, which may be in some ways oppressed, but I don't want to get too far into that. But that's seen as the compelling term that such and such is an oppressed group. It's interesting, though, that this takes place at a time in history amongst groups that are most privileged groups in the world. It's just a historical fact. So what is really happening here? And I would just go back and say, yeah, what's really happening here is that since the emergence of the professional classes have been presenting themselves as representing essential interests that should be met through the political processes, and therefore they need to attract resources to themselves and therefore resources for their support base. What happens, though, is that a disjuncture starts to occur, and this has happened today, and it happened in the Western world with Marxism, is the support base of Marxism, the proletariat, ceased having any interest in Marx. Who had interest in Marx? The intelligentsia. What were the intelligentsia? They weren't the industrial working class. They're not the proletariat. They're people who live off ideas. I'm repeating myself. When we look at Nietzsche now, we can also see how it's possible, as we develop, how the complete antithesis to Marx can be paired with Marx within a certain kind of mentality, a certain kind of class of people living off ideas that they can easily match and mix, because they had already matched and mixed the things from Marx that suited them and just dropped by the by the things that didn't fit. This is what you can do in the realm of ideas. Now, I'm moving to Nietzsche. I was going to read this. I want you to read it. This, I think, it's from a piece called Thus Spoke Zarathustra. Friedrich Nietzsche, it's probably his most poetic. It's a kind of overblown and pseudo-prophetic book. In the German, it has a certain classical, I think it's still overblown, but, you know, rhetorical power. And it certainly shortly after his death, when Nietzsche was alive, he had very few readers. Some of them were quite influential. Some were quite appreciative. But in the main, he had a very small number of readers. He goes mad and he ends up 10 years in an asylum. By the time he dies in 1901, his books are just taking off like wildfire. But why is he so popular? Well, he provides a diagnosis of the social ailments which are sufficiently being appreciated and seen by a class of people that think that he's explained it. And he proffers, like Marx, he proffers a solution, a very different solution. What concerns Nietzsche all the way through? Now, there are some books on Nietzsche that will talk about the different periods of Nietzsche, the early period, the middle period, and the late period. Now, I mentioned to you before that I did my PhD on Karl Marx, as well as Descartes, Kant, and Hegel. I did my master's on Friedrich Nietzsche and Plato. So, like Marx, I spent many, many years reading and thinking about Nietzsche. And I'll give my book a plug. And in this book I published last year called Idolizing the Idea, bestseller. I'm living off the millions of dollars that that's bringing in to fund my retirement. I have sections on Marx and Nietzsche in there. Okay. They say that his work can be divided that way. Look, I think that's oversimplistic. It is true that in different of those three phases, he tends to be emphasizing one thing more than another. But here's the rub. From the earliest writings to his last writings, culture is what he has in mind. And by culture, Nietzsche means creators, the higher level, higher order, creative human beings, and the culture is the expression of that. It's visible not only in the art, but it is visible in the life ways, in the culture, the texture of their daily life, the kind of manners that they have, the way they live. Bluntly, they're masters. I'll come to the master-slave dialectic. Let me just say too, Nietzsche is a very simple philosopher if you understand the keys to what's going on. He repeats himself a lot. If you just start reading Nietzsche, you're going to go, whoa, what's going on? And he's a very, very good writer, except for that's for Zarathustra, I find pompous, overinflated. But other works, he's a great writer, a great stylist. He's a very sharp and penetrative critic of the philosophical tradition, and he does it by zooming in very surgical strike-like statements and insights, which ultimately show you the weaknesses of certain philosophical assumptions or positions. As far as philosophers go, there's few philosophers who read less than Nietzsche in the history of philosophy. There's very few. He was a philologist and he taught Greek and Greek literature and language. He was very well versed in the ancient Greek philosophy. He loved the philosopher Schopenhauer, who influenced him greatly. He had terrible eyesight. He suffered from migraines and he couldn't read for any length of time. He had a good library. He would dip into it, and he says in one of his works, I dip in and out very quickly. But in terms of, if you were to give Nietzsche an examination on Hegel or Kant, I don't believe he could pass it. But having said that, he also says things that, if he's right, would mean that certain things about Kant and Hegel you would have to see are wrong. Okay, so he's very interesting. He's very interesting in this way. But culture is the main thing. He is, as I said, driven by a desire to elevate, to find what is worth elevating, the most admirable of human achievement. And what he sees around him, and this relates to the last man and they blink. And I love this passage. I think this is fantastic. Really, in some ways I'm much more drawn to Nietzsche than Marx, especially this, because Nietzsche really perceives the kind of conformist dumbing down of society that creates a very conformist and compliant society. And this has been a problem that has been identified by philosophers and sociologists right through the 20th century. It's one of the things that unites, say, the Frankfurt School and right-wing or conservative, very right-wing philosophers like Martin Heidegger or Carl Schmitt. Both of them were Nazis for a while, so they're, you know, dreadful people, but they identify in some ways the same kind of problem. And what they see is a kind of massification of what Theodor Adorno from the Frankfurt School calls an administrative society. I think, except Adorno sees that's really administered to serve capital, and others see it, that's really done to just simply to help a bureaucracy. So they, in a sense, they see the same problem, but they have a different objective, a different way out, and they see ultimately a different culprit pulling the strings. Now, in Nietzsche's case, what he's looking at, and if you read this, I mean, it's so great. He's just basically seeing the mindless know-all who really knows nothing, who's had very little experience of the world, wanting to create a world which is so comfortable. And he sees it, and in terms of the state, he calls the state the coldest of cold monsters, serving this entity which ultimately suffocates the human spirit. This is the greatest reason why Nietzsche had such an enthusiastic readership. By the way, he also had enthusiastic readers on the left as well as the right, even earlier. In the main, no, it tended to be regional. I'll put it that way. In France, there were people more on the left that were attracted to Nietzsche, and that would just continue unabated. So it would be a left-wing reading of Nietzsche, which would lead to a fusion of Marx and Nietzsche. In Germany, it would be a much more right-wing reading of Nietzsche, which was why after the end of the Second World War, the Nazis, for reasons that we will show later, are seen as absolutely on the same page as Nietzsche, and so all of a piece. So for example, so after the Second World War, anyone teaching Nietzsche in West Germany was seen as dubious. There was the odd scholar arguing that Nietzsche was not a Nazi, that people should read him, that he's a great thinker, a great philosopher, but in the main, that was a very minor current. And I went to study in Germany in 1980, and I met a philosopher there who was working on Nietzsche and was so happy that I was interested in Nietzsche. But I had to say, even then, I didn't argue with him, but even then, as a very young man doing my master's, I could see, I understood exactly why the Nazis liked Nietzsche, but there's also differences. Okay, big thing. Okay, so the problem The problem is the earth is becoming small, and these little creatures, the last man, the human spirit is being diminished, is being suffocated. And so it's a cultural critique, and it's a kind of cultural critique that will take fire in the 20th century. And even, I'll come back to the National Socialists. This is also driving groups like the National Socialists, as much as conservatives, as much as aristocrats, and some are, especially the cultural Marxist left. The cultural Marxist left is really quite different in this. They have, I think, there's a natural gravitation between their work and Nietzsche's. And this comes out, as I said, when we look in the latter part of the 20th century, or the second half of the 20th century, where that Nietzsche-Marx pairing tends to take place. So, culture and greatness are beyond good and evil. That's the first thing. Good and evil are moral categories, said Nietzsche. Culture has to transcend them. Now, his first book is a book called The Birth of Tragedy. And in that, it really expresses Nietzsche's love of pre-Socratic Greek tragic culture. And in that book, and it will be a constant theme throughout his writings, he raises the issue that with Socrates and Plato, the great culture of the Greeks hit a wall, in fact, hit a dead end, because Socrates and Plato elevated rationality against the instincts, and so they were moralists wanting to curb what he sees as the great natural appetites and instinctual life of the Greeks, and that's Nietzsche is all on display in tragic poetry. So his first book, The Birth of Tragedy and the Spirit of Music, it's also called, I should have added the subtitle. It is really very much directed against Socrates and Plato. And Socrates will be seen as the beginning of the end of a rational culture. At times he calls it an Alexandrian culture, a kind of mentality which tries to understand life not through the living of it, but through the imposition of a certain kind of reflection above what we do. So he's really critical of the world of ideas in Plato, and he sees this Platonic two-worldism as just constantly working itself through the Western world, and he even says that Christianity is Platonism for the people. So he sees Christianity as a variant of the same, what he calls a decadence of the spirit, a spiritual decadence, which is basically trying to withdraw from life into another world. In the case of Socrates and in the case of Plato, that withdrawal is into a world of ideas. So in the world of ideas, it's safe, whereas out there in the world, it's unsafe and unknown. And in the safe space of this world of ideas, there you use that to judge the world. Now, I think this reading of Christianity is not true at all. It's simply not. I think it's historically really wrong. And as I said to you earlier, I think his understanding of church history is zero. He gives occasionally he dips in and takes a bit out to make a point, but it's not based on anything really scholarly, historical knowledge. It is true that there are aspects of certain Christian thinkers, we've studied Augustine, where you can see certain affinities with Platonism, but there's all sorts of other things happening which mitigate against that, including in Augustine. Now, for Nietzsche, the thing that unified, or the thing that was part and parcel of Greek culture, which is expressed in Homeric epic and in Greek tragic poetry, is what he calls the tragic view of life. And the tragic view of life is the complete acceptance of suffering and pain, and knowing that the world is full of suffering, knowing that the world is full of pain. Again, let me contrast this with Christianity. Christianity sees the world as full of suffering and pain. Buddhism sees the world and I'll contrast it with Buddhism, which later Nietzsche goes into considerable, well, he constantly repeats criticisms of Christianity and Buddhism. Buddhism is, and both of them, in a sense, seek a way out of that, a response to that, by renouncing worldly things, a renunciation of the world. Now, in this sense, Nietzsche is absolutely right that he is defending a pagan way of life, which is the antithesis of the Christian, and in its way also of the Buddhist. And it's the antithesis of it because he is saying, no, those withdrawals from life, and he calls this the ascetic ideal, ascetic, A-S-C-E-T-I-C, the ascetic ideal is the retreat to a position of anti-life, of where there's no life. Whereas the tragic is an embracing of life, and it's an acceptance that hardship, suffering, are all the conditions of the heroic engagement with life. So the hero, of course, in the Homeric world and in the tragic world, that's the highest. And the hero is kind of the closest to the gods. And of course, in the tragic worldview, those of you that are doing the subject on foundations of Western civilization, I've gone into that in much more detail, will know that the gods, the pagan gods of in Homer and Hesiod, that it is a world of tumultuous energy, of conflicting forces, divided forces. And from Nietzsche's perspective, this is all about what life is really about. There's no escaping this. There's no escaping that, but this makes you stronger. And the Greeks, he said, they saw what life was like and they loved it. And Nietzsche, he uses, it's a Stoic formulation, actually, and this Nietzsche has some things in common with the Stoics, but there's other things about the Stoics that differ a lot, but I won't go into that. Have the formulation amor fati, to love one's fate. I love one's fate. And Nietzsche says that is what you have to do. Now, note, and this is going to be very important, and it tends to be dropped by North American, let's call it liberal readings, and by populist readings of Nietzsche. Nietzsche doesn't think for a moment he's writing to everybody. But of course, the people that read Nietzsche think, yeah, he's talking about me. Yeah, I'm like that. I'm really great. You know, I can embrace life, and what's that mean? I'll mow the lawn on Saturday and read a book on Saturday night and go to work. You know, what's it mean? In Nietzsche, he is ultimately really talking about a very small group of people who he really valorizes, and they're people, and he mentions them: Julius Caesar, Napoleon, Cesare Borgia. Remember him from Machiavelli. He really liked Machiavelli as well. So these are people. Now they're all from the, in a sense, the military school of life. And there's certain artists that he likes and certain poets that he likes. So it ultimately, but there's groups of people that he likes. The pre-Socratic Greeks. He really likes the Romans under the emperor and possibly even the republic, but the Roman rulers. He likes those people that write the Book of Manu, which is in the Hindu caste system. He supports their willingness to make the Chandala, the lowest caste, really suffer because they have he says they have a good conscience, because they realize their own elevation is built upon, is predicated upon someone doing all the shit work and the groundwork and being kept at a distance. The importance of distance in nature, so that they can have a high culture. But they must be brutal. They must not get sentimental. They must be strong spirit. All of this you can hear where the Nazis would lap this up, even though certain things that Nietzsche says which are very much against the Nazi program. I'll get to that. Now, in his view of the tragic view of life, he contrasts the gods Apollo and Dionysus. It's a very archetypical reading. It means, when I say archetypical, it means slightly distorting the way in which Dionysus and Apollo really figure in Greek mythology. But he is using Dionysus and Apollo as two embodiments of different life energies. And Apollo he sees as a form, surface, light, balance, harmony. Apollo is the archer god of the sun, of form, light, etc. Now, I don't think the Greeks for a moment saw things in such schematic terms, but Nietzsche, writing for a modern audience, reduces the activities of the mythology or the activities of Apollo in Greek mythology to this. And Dionysus is the god of the vine, of music, of suffering, death, and rebirth, of nature. Dionysus is a god of frenzy. He tears himself apart. And his point is this: the Greeks the Greeks have a world in which the spirit of Apollo and the spirit of Dionysus are both present. And he says, and what he gets is, the Dionysian represents the subterranean, ferocious, creative, naturalistic, redemptive in this very pagan sense, set of energies which give birth to the Apolline. Without this undercurrent, you would not have these beautiful temples, the beautiful statues, the beautiful literature of the classics. Now, when Nietzsche is writing this, he's really got in mind the fact that for some 70 or 80 years, a whole lot of rediscoveries and celebration of Greek culture had been happening in Germany. And they were all focused upon aesthetics, beauty, the beauty of form of the Greeks, the beauty of its civilization, and a whole lot of classicists and some philosophers were really valorizing the Greek contribution to the arts, really holding this up to great esteem. So in many ways, aesthetically, the Greeks were being presented as a numero uno of cultural sophistication. So in a sense, as a model Germany should follow. And what Nietzsche is saying is, yeah, you want that, but you don't realize the price you have to pay. The price you have to pay is the frenzy, being beyond good and evil, not being contained morally, tearing yourself apart like the god Dionysus. This is what really made Greece. And you contemporaries, you moderns, you're all weak, and you want to get this, the nice cultural bits, without all the other bits and pieces. And he says, and you'll never have it. And what you'll have is the world you're making, which is small, bourgeois, lacking in spirit, pathetic. It's basically, and you should be spitting in your own face. You're so stupid, and you're so small, and you're so happy with so little. When you read Nietzsche, it's very easy to get, swept along with all this, because, oh yeah, go Fred, because you can see so many things happening in your own world, which kind of confirm it. But at the end of the day, it's a kind of romantic, big-headed picture of the world. Okay, I'll carry on. At this stage too, he was also really enthusiastic about Richard Wagner. I mentioned him last week. Wrote all these very anti-Semitic tracts, but was writing this great new kind of opera, which was kind of meant to be the total artwork, in which the stories, he takes these great stories, but I'm laughing because Wagner saw himself as Beethoven and Shakespeare in one. And I'm laughing because I think the libretto is just terrible, line by line. Unlike Shakespeare, I think it's magnificent. But if you take the total artwork and put it in its place, there's a kind of magnificence about Wagner's work. It's overwhelming. And when you meet Wagnerians, and I've had friends who've gone to, because every year in Bayreuth. How do you spell that? Anyway, Bayreuth. I've had friends that have seen multiple performances of his operas, and I've been to a number. I've been to the Ring Cycle. I've watched it on TV. I've watched. Stood up for Tristan and Isolde for 5 hours in the National Opera Company in England, and it's heavy going. It's heavy going. Some of it's incredibly beautiful, but some of it's heavy going. So Nietzsche was seeing this new art form, this total art form, as fantastic, and he saw this as a great cultural announcement of Germans' gift to the world and Wagner's gift to the world. He would change his mind about Wagner. He would end up putting Wagner along with the Christians and the Buddhists, call them nihilists. And the nihilist is the belief, ultimately they're seeking a space of nothingness, the ascetic ideal. Remember me saying that. So it becomes anti-life. And what caused him to do this was that Wagner had written Parsifal, which is a kind of pagan rendering of a Christianity. It's presenting itself as Christian. Nietzsche reads it as a very Christian moment, but ultimately I don't think it is. Again, I think this to me only shows that Nietzsche is only interested in certain features of Christianity. Now, one of the things when Nietzsche fell in love with Wagner, he actually fell heavily in love with Wagner's wife, Cosima von Bülow, but she wasn't interested in him. But when Wagner sent him, they both, Nietzsche says, it's like two swords crossing. Nietzsche had written a book called Human, All Too Human. Wagner had written Parsifal, and Human, All Too Human. Nietzsche's really starting to come into his own now about where he's feeling about Christianity and such like, and really developing his philosophy. And that was a cause of rupture. But when they had met, they were both very influenced by the philosopher Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer, unlike Nietzsche, really liked the Buddhists. He also liked the Hindus, but for very different reasons to Nietzsche, and basically because of certain overlaps he saw between Buddhism and Hinduism. And as you know, Buddhism evolves out of, or you may know, Buddhism evolves out of, but as a reaction to Hinduism, especially the caste system within Hinduism. But lots of bits of Hinduism are retained, other bits are jettisoned. Okay, so this is Nietzsche on the one hand, anti-Socratic, early on very pro-Wagner, then very anti-Wagner, both driven and fused by Schopenhauer's philosophy, which basically argued that the world is driven by the will. So it's basically a view of life in which the organic and the inorganic ultimately become a continuum. And organic life creates its own representations of what the world is. And I don't want to go too much into this, but Schopenhauer basically does a very carved up, mixed up version of the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And in the philosophy of Immanuel Kant, something called the thing in itself is a decisive role. I don't want to get into that, but I'll just say this much. In Kant, the whole idea of the thing in itself is to basically counter concept to the kind of filters that we use in making judgments and claims about the world or about morality or about art. But the thing in itself is what the world would be if we didn't have these filters. So it's a concept about which you can't really say anything except it's a counter concept. Schopenhauer says, no. It's not that we can't know the thing in itself is the will. That's the driver of all our representations. So we are driven by will. And in this sense, and it's very interesting, Schopenhauer both claims that the most important inspirers of his work are Plato and Kant, And yet in everything he does, it's turning them completely on the head. It's a completely anti-Platonic and anti-Kantian philosophy. And Nietzsche's philosophy is explicitly as much anti-Kantian as anti-Platonic philosophy. The thing, when you think of Kant, just think the main thing in his philosophy is morality, what he calls a categorical imperative. That is come up with a law. You make maxims which you yourself could universalize and be subject to. And that is basically in where our moral freedom consists. That's Kant, the Kellogg's cornflake back of the pack. Summing up, and Nietzsche hates that. He just hates that. He hates Kant, and he hates everything. If you remember from Plato what we did and what I said about the effects of life here, Nietzsche hates all that as well. But so in that sense, I think he's much more consistent, and he's got, at least because he knows Plato well, he's got a much more accurate understanding of what Plato was doing than Schopenhauer. And he hits upon the essence of what he dislikes in Kant, and his critique of that is there. Okay, but the will is a blind force. Nietzsche will take it from, and Nietzsche will then come up with this idea, not as Schopenhauer said. Schopenhauer sees the will as wanting to preserve itself. And for Schopenhauer, this is a problem. Schopenhauer looks at the world, so we can see that Nietzsche's reaction to Wagner is also going to be bound up with his reaction to Schopenhauer, and in many ways Parsifal is a very Schopenhauerian. It's kind of Buddhist Christianity almost, with medieval dress on it. Schopenhauer is basically looking at history as a slaughterhouse. It's horrible. Now, Schopenhauer really hated Hegel, and he even taught in the same university, and he put his lectures on at the same time as Hegel because he hated Hegel so much. And Schopenhauer got 0 students. None would attend his lectures. They would all go to Hegel. And this really embittered Schopenhauer. But the reason he hated Hegel, or one of the many reasons, he hated everything about Hegel's philosophy. But Hegel's philosophy is about reason in history. And in some ways you can see what Marx is doing is a kind of variant on that, in spite of what he says. It's a variant on that. But Nietzsche, so Schopenhauer is seeing history as just a bloodbath of chaos. And what the reason it's that way is the human will, in its desire to preserve itself, is prepared to constantly destroy everything in order for its willful imposition of its representation. So it's a drive that sets goals for itself, and the goals all end up being destructive and bloody and horrible. And Schopenhauer says the only thing we can do about this is to stop willing. So this is why I like the Buddhists and he liked the Hindus. So it's basically you meditate your way out of it. You withdraw from the world. It ends up being very renunciative. Nietzsche hates that. That's wrong. No. All true what you're saying, except it's power. That the will is seeking more of itself. And what you have are basically two kinds of life forms, One affirming itself, getting bigger and bigger, and the other one not able to go anywhere, so it turns in upon itself because it's thwarted and it's dying. So you have all life is will to power, and you have the will to power that is affirmative and the will to power that is negating. And the negating will to power is kind of like a death wish. Freud would use those terms, a life wish and a death wish. Freud was, by the way, very influenced by Nietzsche. So every specific body, note this, the will and the body are all of a piece. It's all of a piece. So in some ways you can see elements of Leibniz, which also you can see in Schopenhauer's philosophy. Leibniz's philosophy was a very dynamic philosophy, a philosophy of force, the dynamism of force. Again, I love Leibniz, and I don't want to go into it too much, but all I'm simply wanting you to get a sense of here is how this becomes very biologically driven. It's very biological. It will also physiological. It's voluntarist. It's about the will, but it's also about the body and the will all being tied up. And all of them are caught in this endless cycle of power, which is ultimately thwarted and weakened when it takes the ascetic ideals as Christians, Buddhists, Wagner, Schopenhauer, and other nihilists, he calls them. Whenever they do that, the weak, it's the way of the weak. See, this is going to be there all through his philosophy, the strong and the weak. And Nietzsche's thought is predicated upon all these dualisms. It's a philosophy that's meant to be beyond any dualism, beyond good and evil. That's the title of one of his books, and I mentioned that before, Beyond Good and Evil. It's meant to be beyond, but always we see in Nietzsche weak, strong, cultured, uncultured, the anti-life, pro-life, etc. There's all these dualisms running through, because ultimately, very in this way, it's quite analogous to what Marx does with Clark, that, you know, these duality and polarization. I will go for another 15 minutes today. I had thought I'd get all through this stuff. Got excited about it. And so I will go to about 4:15. So Nietzsche also says, all truth is perspectival. If you said what I said about the will, the drive creates its own means of world making, and it thus represents the world. And Schopenhauer's great book is called The Will and Representation, or The World as Will and Representation, sometimes translated as the world and will and idea, but the word is Vorstellung in German. That means you set it before yourself, before your mind. It's a mental setting forth. So what Schopenhauer and Nietzsche are basically saying is that the drive, the kind of being that you are, selects from this great carnival of the real, this great whirl of tumult. It creates patterns in order to suit its way of life. And then within that, as I said, in the case of Schopenhauer, it just keeps tumult upon tumult upon tumult. And he wants to get out of that what he sees as the story of the cycle of life in Buddhism and Hinduism. This means then all truth is perspectival. Every truth is really and by truth he's not just talking about an analytic truth like 2 by 2 is 4, but the truth that you live in, the truth of your life way, the things that you sacrifice yourself, your ultimate appeals, that these truths are ultimately come down to the perspective of the kind of being, the kind of power that you will and are. You are your will to power. Okay. Can't believe this. This did not look like this morning, but I will talk about this. So Nietzsche says I've gone through all of history. You know, they're just like Marx, you know, that you never come out of going through all of history, it's too big. But I've gone through it all, I've seen two patterns. And there's two kinds of morality. There's master morality and slave morality. Master morality, it has the duality that it works with is good and bad. The slave morality works with good and evil. Now, master morality works like this. I'm a master, my life is good, what happens to me is being good, I affirm life, see all that tragic view of life. I love my life, I have all this power to live a good life, and if that means going into battle and even losing a limb, so be it. Great, I love it. I love it. This is a life worth living. Bad is being a poor wretch who's been enslaved, a poor wretch who, you know, is hopeless, who has no pedigree, has no place in the world, has nothing to celebrate, who's just unfortunate. It really means unfortunate. And as a master, they're just a resource for me. They exist under my sufferance, especially if I've enslaved them. They exist under my sufferance, and they're just there for me to use. And my world as a will to my own power means that I'm going to cooperate with certain other people who are like me, other masters, but enslaving others, that's bad. It's bad to be a slave, but it's not evil. It's just unfortunate. And they don't really matter. They don't really matter. They're going to squawk and suffer and bleat. And, but who are they? What do they matter? So the master doesn't moralize about life. They accept the tragic condition. The master doesn't feel guilty about life. They just see this is the play of forces. The master sees itself and the world as mutually supportive of each other. And again, I think Nietzsche is really oversimplifying the Greek view of the world. I think this is not really true. I can see, you can read Homer closely and you can see bits and pieces of the tragic poets where you see this, but there's all sorts of other things where Zeus, for example, is talking about how the humans blame him for what befalls them, but it's their own fault. He looks down with pity on people slaughtering each other. The Greeks have a much more ambivalent view about war than you get from Nietzsche's rendering of it. Nietzsche, again, very similar to Marx, he reads everything through the objective he's trying to reach, and it becomes very selective. Okay, so slave morality. Slave morality is basically an interiorized will to power. It's the will to power of the weak. It's the will to power of the oppressed. It's the will to power of those who have been put in a position of enslavement. And in that sense, he says the Jews were the master people of this, what he calls resentment. Every part of their morality is really conjured up, he says, in response to the suffering that they blame upon their oppressors. Note this, when we look later at post-structuralism and what I said about cultural Marxism, that whole philosophy is based upon emancipation for the oppressed, of the oppressed, against the oppressor. All of that stuff, and we'll see it again. And this is so ubiquitous in the academic world. Now, how you wrote Nietzsche onto your side in this is breathtaking. Because for Nietzsche, that stuff would all be just post-Jewish, post-Christian crap. It would all be the philosophy of weakness. I'm not saying he's right, I'm just saying what he would see it as. It would all be poisonous view of life. It would all be based upon a deficiency of energy and power. It's all based upon lack, upon what you don't have, upon the misery of your existence. So you blame someone else for that. And you blame them because of your lack of power. This is the key to Nietzsche's distinction between master morality and slave morality. And if you write on Nietzsche, please don't just go and read Walter Kaufmann, who's a very good translator, but a terrible interpreter of Nietzsche, because he spends so much of his book trying to make Nietzsche not say what he's saying, and he really distorts all these quotes in Nietzsche. It's appalling stuff. And I mention Kaufmann specifically because he played a huge part in the rendering and the reception of Nietzsche from the 1950s through 60s and 70s in North America and Canada and Great Britain. Very good translator, but this view, he says, Nietzsche is not really supporting the master against the slave. And this is just not true. At the end of The Genealogy of Morals, the first essay, he says, won't there have to be an even more terrible flaring up of the old flame, one prepared much longer in advance, and more, shouldn't one desire that with all one's strength, or will it even, or even promote it? in the before the Nazis got to power and during the Nazis got to power, everyone who was a Nietzschean, or pretty well everyone who was Nietzschean, was thinking in terms of masters' morality. Even Trotsky at one point quotes Nietzsche to justify the kind of new man under communism. Even Trotsky does it. So this master-slave morality, he basically also sees breeding as intrinsic to culture. He sees this as I said, physiological. He sees biological, it's genetically passed on. And he sees Christianity as the rising of the weak against the strong, and basically it comes out of Judaism. He sees, as I said, he sees Judaism as a slave religion. Remember that, and this is quite true, the Jews were captive in Egypt, so they were slaves. There's a historical truth there, but whether or not it ultimately plays out the way in terms of culture and what matters and what should matter, etc., as in Nietzsche, that's another thing altogether. But he says what Christianity does is he takes what is the Jews had figured out and then tries to universalize this by hunting down the masters. So he's basically saying the spread of Christendom is really the spread of slave morality, and it's a hunting down all the noble types. So for him, the Christianization of Western Europe means really taking, I'll give you a very good example of what Nietzsche is talking about, of an image that I had in my head when I saw this. I was in Hong Kong and I went, and the Swedish program had a Christmas carol procession, right? And amongst I was really struck by the leader of the group, and he was enormous. He was about 7 foot tall, right? I think he might have been the Swedish consul in Hong Kong. And there he is with this little candle. So it's this kind of Christian procession taking place in Hong Kong where they're singing carols. And here's this huge man, and behind him are all these young children with holding their little candles. And he's as gentle and delicate as if, you know, almost on tiptoe, and the image is so strong. And then you compare that with, you know, what the Vikings were like, going, you know, back 1,000 years, of, you know, before Christianity comes into Sweden in the 11th, 12th century, maybe even later part of the 12th century. And what you had, you know, there you had a race of people that would go down, plunder, conquer, sometimes settle, but basically a warring nation. And now you have this man with a candle, and you think, yeah, that's what Nietzsche's talking about. Now, some people say, well, isn't that a better thing? But Nietzsche doesn't think so. I'm not. I honestly, I think that is. It doesn't matter what I think, but Nietzsche doesn't think so. So in the genealogy of morals, again, you can read this at your leisure. This passage is really about how, and you can see the continuation of the Apollonian Dionysian theme in this quotation. So the masters amongst themselves, you know, all sorts of customs, and that's what culture is: constraint, artifice, resourcefulness, in a sense tying down the energies. But then there's this outbreak, an outpouring of energy. So this is a kind of transmogrification of energy, the Dionysian into the Apollonian. And this is, and what Nietzsche is saying is, you look at all these great people in history that have left behind great cultural artifacts, and what they've been is that wild beasts who've at times gone out, raped and tortured, acted, you know, with absolute brutality, They've been like the blonde beasts. They've been like lions, carrying out the spoils of victory, enjoying themselves. It's the noble races were the barbarians. They're the best of. They're the best of. And you, addressing the Europeans, you want meaning, you want culture, you want to be something. Well, you can't be it the way you're going. And Christianity has been like this poison that you swallow. You can't simply be great and be good in that way. If you want to be good, you've got to be great. And you've got to get rid of this notion of guilt. You've got to get rid of this notion of evil. You've got to get rid of all the things that all the leftist, bourgeois, feminist, all this array of cultural, intellectual forces which were starting to swim into the mainstream of intellectual life beginning around this time, a bit earlier, some, you know, got to tear that all out. You've got to get rid of it. So that's what Nietzsche is saying. Now, he basically sees Christianity as having a big legacy. And I'll just run through them. One is he thinks the will to truth in science actually comes from Christianity. That's a very unusual claim, because given the anti-Christianity of many of the intellectuals of the French Revolution, you would think that Christianity had created an anti-intellectual culture. But the fact is that Christian culture became, over time, one of the most intellectual cultures ever. There were moments, substantial periods of time, in parts of the Muslim world where you had a very well-developed intellectual culture. And of course, Greece and Rome. But basically, the instantiation of the institutions of the intellect under Christendom were unparalleled, and it was through the university system, the network of university system, that science developed. And then it would have to move outside the universities. You remember me saying how Descartes was attacked, but ultimately it still fed back in to the broader culture, which was still very much Christian, but beginning in the Enlightenment move, which then leads back away from Christianity. So the interplay of Christianity with the pagan tradition, with Greek ideas, Jewish and Greek intermingling within Christianity, it's very complex. But I just say again that Nietzsche, I think he's on to something. I'm not saying it's completely right, but he sees the will to truth of science. And here's the point. Nietzsche is also saying there is no truth. No real truth. Now, you know, kids come out of high school blathering this, there is no truth, whatever I think is true and so on, because they've heard that and they think that sounds clever. What Nietzsche means by this is that there is no truth means that values, what we value, don't all cohere in any logical manner that reason alone can provide. It just isn't that way. Remember, it's a will to power. And so being will to power, there's no truth, because there's going to be a multiplicity of wills to power, a multiplicity of truths. This is why he also says that the famous place this is presented, you see it in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, but in a work called The Gay Science, he has a section where the madman goes into the market swinging a lantern. And as he swings the lantern, he says, "Have you not heard?" And he's being laughed at and mocked by people in the marketplace, that God is dead. And then he says, we have to live up. We've killed God. We have to live up to the deed. We've been his murderers. And what he's saying is that the search through science for the truth, the will to truth, which is part of the development of the transference of scientific inquiry outside of simply nature into the human life world, that this this development has ultimately led to the realization that we have all these different cultures, if you like. That was Herder's position, though I think much more sophisticated than Nietzsche, but Herder's position. And with Nietzsche, it's all bound up to will to power. So there is no truth, he says. This leads to a condition of what he calls nihilism, because there is no truth and we're searching for meaning. And as we've developed this, we've also denuded all the faith, the Christian faith. He's basically saying no one who's smart can believe in Christianity, which again, that's not really true, because if you look at Soren Kierkegaard and Fyodor Dostoevsky, two of the greatest thinkers of the 19th century, were very Christian, and they have similar critiques in some way to Nietzsche about the danger to the diminution of the spirit, but on the other hand, they don't believe in the Superman idea, which is ultimately the end product of what Nietzsche is talking about, is the Superman or Overman who will be the ruler of the earth. So they think this is all nonsense. And Dostoevsky, in his work on, in his great book, The Brothers Karamazov, talks about the danger of the God-man, of being an insane idea that's going to destroy a whole generation and do so much damage. Soren Kierkegaard, on the other hand, attacked institutional Christianity, but valorized old-style Christianity. Because I've set the timer the way I have, I'm going to round up in 2 minutes. I just want to finish this slide. Nihilism, says Nietzsche, is the overwhelming conviction that because life has no meaning and life is worthless, that we are paralyzed from action. But to see beyond it, we must realize that we must construct our truth. We must give ourselves a truth. So there's a positive side to nihilism. And these truth givers will be the philosophers of the future. And in the work Beyond Good and Evil, there's a section devoted to the philosophers of the future. Feuerbach was also looking for philosophers of the future. And in his way, I think we can see that that's what Marxism is ultimately looking for. So these are people trying to build the world in accordance with their conviction. And in the case of Nietzsche, it's the higher men, those that love culture, who are game enough, willing enough to embrace the hardship, not the Democrats, not those who have faith in equality, or the democratic movement, or the women's movement, or the workers' movement. For him, these are all just the fruits, the dead fruits, the stale fruits of Christianity, the rotten fruits. These are simply Christianity manque Christ, Christianity lacking any mythological foundational moment. They're just empty ideas. Kant had said of freedom, it's a moral idea. For Nietzsche, this just is vacuous. Why in God's name? And these are really serious issues that our intelligentsia and our elite today have stopped to ask, and they have no idea. It's quite shocking, really, that they can read Nietzsche, but they blink like the last men and last women, not realizing how serious Nietzsche's diagnosis. And in this respect, it's very serious. It's very serious because our intellectual culture, the culture that we're drawing upon now, is so based upon the role of the professional classes to articulate and monitor and spread ideas, but at their core, they're nothing more than ideas. That's very different from previous religious faiths. And there's nothing to stop other than jailing people like Nietzsche and his followers, executing them eventually, or making sure they don't get published or have a job, stopping them. I'll carry on next week. I will be able to wrap it all up. Last week I went on a bit more about Marx than I wanted to. Okay, but I will want to finish off Nietzsche, and then we'll do kind of a quick overview of ideas of the 20th and into the 21st century that have had impact in political thought. Okay, thank you.